the stakes could not be higher in terms of European security. We have a war going on the European landmass for 3+ years, and with an adversary that's determined to persist and prevail against sovereign Ukraine, and then is also threatening Western countries in outside the EU. So there's a lot at stake. That is where the potential use of the seized Russian assets is enormous. If it happens, it could be a game changer.
Hello and welcome to On the Edge. Our guest this week is Douglas Mason. Born in Canada, he earned his degree as an economist, but he has become something of an independent journalist. And since the full-scale invasion began, he has been traveling all around this country on several trips, reporting on a number of different topics, getting his works published in some very prestigious outlets. But he's also been keeping an eye particularly on all things fiscal, because funding this war is integral to fighting it. So, Douglas Mason, thank you so very much for taking some time out of your day there in one of my favorite cities in the world, Odessa. The first question I just have to ask you, I know we're all journalists and, journalists have a vocation, but why Ukraine? What brought you to Ukraine?
Well, wonderful question, and thank you, Phil, for the opportunity to be here and speak with you. Why Ukraine? Why me? Why here now? It's a fair question to ask, but Ukraine has inspired many people internationally. I mean, there's a big cohort here of volunteers and journalists. And so certainly for myself in 2022, when this conflict happened, the issues just seemed so stark and compelling. There is this elected government that's trying to get the basics right in terms of running a modern, representative and responsive democracy backed by an open society. And that being under threat from the Russian invasion, it was quite such a dire situation with such serious consequences, and the Ukrainian people fighting back, doing what they've done in terms of mounting a defense and keeping an open democracy functioning with all of its stresses and strains. So it certainly inspired me right away. Wanted to be here. Journalism is storytelling, but it's also the very noble vocation of bearing witness to injustice. I've got a reporting career throughout Africa, UN peacekeeping, Canadian government, and my own, recreated myself a few times to be a journalist. And so very inspiring to be in Ukraine.
And how have you found it? I mean, how you've been coming here repeatedly. How has your experience been in getting to know the Ukrainian people and seeing them bearing witness through this very traumatic and difficult time? How have your interactions been?
Well, I'd say all the human interactions I have in this country seem to have meaning and impact and consequence. It's part of a lived experience. Now, I've been coming here since 2022. This is my third occasion that I'm here. Each of them have been like sort of 6-week periods. It's the amount of time I could get off. I'd certainly be here longer if I could. But each time it's a bit of a snapshot. Coming back this time, and I do stay abreast of events when I'm abroad, but there is no substitute for being in country. Understanding of Vox Populi is just its sentiment, its vibe, its nuance, is what you pick up from conversations. Certainly at this point in time, it's clear that the Ukrainians are exhausted. It's been going on so long, and they're doing all the right things, and it's not over yet. So certainly I'm picking up on that sentiment, but still the same sort of can-do attitude and defiance. But yes, definitely, I can feel that people are taking strain, and you're aware of yourself all the stress points of this society, and like any open democracy, open society, there's going to be stresses and strains. It's remarkable that the government here is actually as popular as it is, because it tends to be quite typical of any Western government. Yeah, that they don't stay popular very long. It's just the nature of democracy. The level of scrutiny and judgment is so intense. Um,
And
so very inspiring for me to be here.
yeah, and I think you're right. I think there is something where you actually physically have to be here to kind of pick up the atmosphere and the kind of general mood of the people. And I think you're also right that they still stand supporting their government, in particular President
Mhm.
Zelensky. There is some fraying, however, at the edges. We all must acknowledge that. I mean, we've had politicians here on the show and spoken to them about the very first days of the war, in which they kind of made this pact that they would set
Mhm.
aside domestic, squabbles
Mhm.
for the betterment of the country at a time of war. But that, that's a difficult thing to maintain. What's your impression
Sure.
of how things are going when it comes to Ukrainians and their elected officials?
Well, it's a complicated relationship, as you have just outlined yourself. People give sort of a conditional backing to this government. It's not something that's carte blanche, and people are allowed to have opinion. And the longer any government stays in power, any democratic government, the less popular it becomes. Because to govern is to uh, expose the human spirit and human foibles to political failure, which is such a ruthless game. But it's a necessary one in an open society where that society is holding the government to account. So all kinds of caveats about this government. First of all, we have to say, compared to what's gone previously, Ukraine really struggled coming out of the starting gates after the Berlin Wall and the Warsaw Pact dissolved. And a lot of false starts, but twice there have been popular uprisings, the Orange and Maidan revolutions, the color revolutions, and now we have a government that is reasonably representative. I think they're not getting it right a lot of the times. If you go back to the old Holoboroko character of Zelensky, when he was in servant of the people, I think he kind of foretold that even an honest person coming to government in this country is going to make mistakes, might even have people on their team that are open to some of the temptations of ill governance. That is certainly happening. To pretend otherwise would be to deny um, the nature of the human spirit and experience, as we know it. Just a final point to make there is, Phil, I see this government as sort of popular, but with lots of caveats. But what I have noticed is that, okay, broadly people do respect this government. I think it's one they chose, and it needs to carry on its mandate during a war. There's not going to be an election while there's a war on. It's just not legally possible to do that under martial law. Um,
Not to
but
mention, not to mention, how are the Ukrainians who are currently living under occupation going to cast their ballots?
Yeah,
Should there
there's
be an
so many
election? So many
complicating
reasons
factors
for
that make an election not
yeah.
possible. But one thing I do notice is when the situation is dire, then people tend to increase their support for the government. As we saw with the Oval Office fiasco between Zelensky and Trump, the immediate reaction in Ukraine was overwhelming support for the president as our elected leader. at a time when there was a perception at that point that um, foreign banking was no longer assured from the United States at that point, and it might have quite serious consequences for the ability of the country to sustain an active defense. So the support goes up. What I see is when things are a bit more normal, then public opinion oscillates back to a more skeptical, critical attitude. These rascals, these clowns, and I'm sure some of them are, misperforming or underperforming, and there might be, um, you know, acts going on with the private sector and the society and state institutions and the government itself. That's going to be open to scrutiny at any given time in any Western society. There will be all kinds of scrutiny over practices that are questionable. That is the nature of an open society, for those issues to be raised and discussed and aired, and ultimately for the government in power to be held account.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in addition to that, the corruption issue is something that they are currently tackling, but it's going to be a very, very long process. And the last thing on that whole thing that I'd just like to mention is that this is all 100% legal. The RADA, the Congress, the legislative body here voted for martial law. There was a physical vote. So all of this is
Yes.
legal. Now, and oh, by the way, we will include links to Douglas's work, because he does talk on a wide range of societal questions and what's it like to be in Ukraine, be Ukrainian right now. So on the human aspect, but I have to ask you a couple of questions on your area of expertise.
Sure.
Because I think it's very important, and I don't get the opportunity to do it as much as I would like. You write in kind of primarily economic forums, and you have a long history as an economist. We have to talk about this as simply as
Sure.
as simply as you can, if you don't mind, because, as I say, I am not an economist. But the most important question I think I have when it comes to this is, tell me what your estimation is of the state of the Russian economy.
Okay, a very pertinent issue at this time. Well, okay, the Russian economy is taking strain. The degree to which that's happening is what is most of interest to economists, and I think to Ukrainians, who would like to see the cost of that war escalated, and there be a price to be paid by Russia for what it's doing. Yes, that is happening. This is an economy that's actually been quite resilient. That's been noted for quite some time. The government kind of opened the war with some pretty strong macroeconomic stabilizers. Putin's always been a bit of a neoliberal. And so competent technocratic management has meant that the impact of sanctions in the war has been relatively limited. I think that that free ride, if you want to call it that, is coming to an end right now. In that the data I'm seeing is the Russian economy has gone from like 4% growth last year down to 1% forecast for this year. And it's probably not going to get better for a while for a number of reasons. There's just massive labor scarcity in the economy, and that's bumping up against the recruitment needs of the Russian military. And the combined and persistent effect of sanctions is it does raise costs for government to carry on doing its business. So that is what we're seeing in Russia. And then there's also the very successful Ukrainian drone and other aerial attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, to the point that quite a lot of their production has been taken offline. There was an attack on a refinery 2,000 kilometers behind the front lines yesterday. That was further than the Russians thought the Ukrainians could hit them, but they did. And there's another Russian refinery going up in flames. I think the last data I saw was at least 20% of their production was out of commission by sort of early September or late August, and it's might probably be higher right now. Yes, Russia is taking strain. Can they go on financing the war? Yes, they can, but it does involve trade-offs. and quite difficult policy choices. There's cost for what they're doing. That's going to go on increasing. Well, fantastic. That's what sanctions are supposed to do. And that's what happens if you launch a foreign war and are unable to win it, and then refuse to accept that and carry on the very real human and other costs for 3.5 years.
Is there a breaking point for them, do you think? And are we talking in terms of months, years, 5 years, God
Uh,
forbid, 10 years?
um, I don't know. I'm not sure. Committing to a breaking point is a very specific period of time. I think we're just seeing accumulated costs are increasing. Russia's ability to finance and prosecute this war and keep a stable economy is going to become increasingly difficult. We're seeing a lot of signs now of stagflation. So
Hmm.
that is where inflation goes up. Interest rates are very high and real, but the economy isn't growing very much. I think there's some pretty serious supply side constraints in the Russian economy. You can go on spending more money and growth won't go up. Even production won't go up that much, not in a direct input out relationship in the way it's been happening up until now. So, yes, those costs are coming. They are going to accumulate. Is there a breaking point? I don't know. There will just be progressively more negative effects for the Russian economy. That is what's happening. Where that goes in terms of does it go into a set of factors that would influence Vladimir Putin's decision to stop prosecuting this war? Well, that's the $1 million question. At what point does he go there? Um, and he's a dictator, so that point really is his arbitrary decision. He could go on prosecuting this war for years, saying we'll never give up. Those are the narratives, the public narratives that Russia trades in. I think it's diversionary in that it hides the real costs. You can have these narratives that Russia has staying power, will never give up, we're going to carry on. Okay, well, that's great on the level of rhetoric, and it is backed by a political commitment, but the costs are just horrendous militarily and human. Over 1 million dead and wounded, about 1,000 Russian soldiers a day being killed or wounded. In return for what? In the last year, the Russian army gained 0.6% of Ukrainian territory. That is just a horrendously bad result for the Russians. They can go on trying to hide that by saying, well, we're going to continue indefinitely for as long as it takes. Well, okay, go on saying that, but you might find yourself in 2 years, things are, you haven't achieved your objective. I don't see the Ukrainian armed forces buckling, and that's the important point. Right now, with the advances of drone warfare, an armored breakthrough or other breakthrough is now very difficult to have happen. Well, and thank goodness. And we have very strong, innovative armed forces in this country. We can also get in later, as you wish, to talk about that on a technical level. It's quite remarkable. Ukraine is now a world leader in drone technology. Other countries come here to learn. Weapon systems supplied by Western countries are being battle tested here, and when found wanting, have to be improved. So there's a constant loop feedback in innovation, and the West needs to be here. Their security depends on it.
Yeah.
That's quite a new and unusual situation for Ukraine, in that it does have leverage for the first time.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I want to circle back. I want to circle back to that, and we will when we delve into the Ukrainian economy. But I'd like to take it before we do that, kind of to the global, or at least the regional level. You talk about yes, some 20% of the refinery, apparently, from reports, capability of Russia has been knocked out, and obviously that's detrimental to them. They still, however, are circumventing in many ways what is the sanctions that have been put on them by the use of what is called their shadow fleet, and one of their primary
Mhm.
consumers of their natural gas, despite the sanctions, is India. Recently, we have heard from a very temperamental administration in Washington, which can be quixotic at the best of times, But it does seem like right now the administration of Donald Trump is looking to put some pressure on Modi of India to comply with the sanctions. How damaging do you think that would be for the Russians if somehow Trump were to apply that pressure and Modi said, okay, we're not going to buy Russian gas anymore?
Okay, if India took that decision, yes, there would be serious consequences for Russia. Is that likely to happen? No, I don't think so, because the Indians don't want to give in on something that's important to them. They've done well off of cheaper Russian energy imports. So I think we're hearing a lot of rhetoric from President Trump about that issue. Is it being backed up with real action? Well, no. Okay, India has the tariff war going on with the US. That's something separate. But the idea of imposing 100% tariffs on India in order to get it to stop buying Russian oil, I don't think Trump is going to follow through with that. It's one of these many things where there's quite heavy rhetoric and threats, and then
Taco.
seems to lose attention. Yeah, the taco principle. Trump always chickens out. I think this is probably a case in point. You can't just go on threatening every country in the world and be doing it all of them at the same time, because
Well,
these are dynamic situations.
something,
India, or like any other country, Canada, is going to respond in ways that are unexpected, and the dynamic moves on. So yeah, a lot more could be done to tighten sanctions. Is Trump going to do it? Well, it's really hard to say. He's making these threats, but hasn't followed through. And then often you get these sort of follow-up caveat comments from him. Well, yeah, we'll do it against China and India, against Russian oil, if the Europeans do it first. Well, I mean, you kind of know that the Europeans can't, because you've got two members of the European Union, Hungary and Slovakia. They're getting most of their energy imports still from Russia. And those are not uncoincidentally pockets of support for Russia inside the European Union. I think we have to be careful when we say support. I just feel that leaders like Orban and Fico, they're very wily populists, and it's like a whack-a-mole. They kind of jump around all the time with different things. Are they actively pro-Russian, or do they just don't want to have to pay an economic price by helping Ukraine? I think it's probably more of the latter.
Well, I know an awful lot of Ukrainians that are going to be disheartened by that kind of that opinion, because they're desperate to shut down the very same thing that is funding the war for the Russians. And notably, of course, you point out the sales to European members, but also that shadow fleet has got to be shut down. So, we can only hope. But there is another alternative also that we need to discuss when it comes to other ways, when it comes to some other methodology that folks are thinking about starving the Russians off financially so they can't continue to pay for this war. And that is the discussion that exists around the seizure of Russian assets. I wonder if you could walk me through what is being proposed. Are we talking about individuals, state-run and owned assets? What would this mean for banking? I know a lot of bankers have put the criticism forward that they worry that this would set a precedent that would, stymie putting. If you're wealthy and you want to deposit your money in a Swiss bank, and you're Saudi, and maybe the Saudi, the House of Saud is going to do something, and because your leadership does something, my Swiss bank account gets to set that precedent, has a lot of people very concerned. That's the criticism I hear of it. I wonder if you could walk me through what this realistically would look like, and do you think there's growing support for actually doing it?
Okay. Yeah, you've encapsulated all the major issues there, Phil, very well. So is it going to happen, and what effect would it have, and what actually is being proposed? So what's being proposed is that There's nearly 200 billion euros of frozen Russian central bank assets that are frozen in the Euroclear system in Belgium. And now there's a discussion about whether or not those funds should be used for Ukraine to finance its war against that's been brought upon it by Russia. So the proposal is, and this came up last week from Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, who's always been rather a cautious figure, and Germany's always been a very cautious voice at the table when these kinds of issues have been discussed. But he popped up with an editorial in the Financial Times last week saying now is the time when this measure needs to be considered. So the way it would work is the funds would be turned over to Ukraine, which would sort of give an IOU back to the Euroclear system. It's holding the assets on behalf or at the direction of the European Union governments and other Western governments. Canada's involved as well. The way it would work is Ukraine would get access to those funds and could start spending them on its own war-related needs, which is about 40 billion a year at this point of external support. 40 billion US, not exactly, not giving you an exact number, but it's a ballpark figure. So that would then be a sort of an IOU, and the funds would be turned over to Ukraine to use for its own purposes, and would then be recovered later through a war reparations claim against Russia. So in terms of international law, it's kind of tricky, and there's a lot of risks involved. This is not something to be taken lightly in terms of ultimate liability, international law, and the role of the euro currency as a global reserve currency. So lots of caution, justifiable caution about, whoa, what's really involved here. At the same time, the stakes could not be higher in terms of European security. We have a war going on the European landmass for 3+ years, and with an adversary that's determined to persist and prevail against sovereign Ukraine, and then is also threatening Western countries in outside the EU. So there's a lot at stake. This really is potentially a game changer. It's massive, Phil, in that if this was to go ahead, and that's not a given right now. We had a meeting last week in Copenhagen with the European heads of state and heads of government where the issue was discussed. There was not unanimous support. There's quite a lot of skepticism from various circles. But that's the way the European Union works. And the issue is now on the table. Let's hope it moves ahead. It does have the potential to be a huge, huge game changer, because what it does do is attack a central hypothesis for Russia, or a calculation by Russia under Putin, that it can go on threatening to continue the war indefinitely and trade in narratives about its staying power, indifference to losses, nothing's going to stop us, we don't care if we're losing all of this number of soldiers that are dying in combat, and having this stalemate. Well, I mean, that's where Russia is trying to substitute a big gap on its side, in that it doesn't have the military capability to subdue and crush Ukraine right now. And it's not closer to that either. In fact, the battlefield trends seem to be quite, to some degree, going in Ukraine's favor. The main one really is just that defenses are holding. Yes, they're giving up land bit by bit, but exacting a terrible cost that Russia is paying. Russia wants to trade in this narrative that that's an acceptable cost. They'll go on paying it indefinitely. Well, you have to puncture that narrative if you can come up with a proposition that Ukraine could fund its war at the rate of 40 billion a year for the next 5 years or more. That sends a very direct message to Russia about the staying power of Ukraine and the European Union and other Western supporters of Ukraine. That yes, they will stay as long as it takes and outlast this sort of Russian onslaught. That is where the potential use of the seized Russian assets is enormous. If it happens, it could be a game changer. I don't want to spend too much time on the topic. It's up to you, Phil. I'll just say quickly that there's a little side issue to do with Canada.
Okay.
And I am Canadian.
All right.
and that is that there is a bill in front of Canadian both houses of Parliament, uh, Special Economic Measures Act, which has been passed by the Senate and has to go back to the to Parliament. But what it would do is it would seize the assets, Russian central bank assets that are held in Canadian dollars in Canadian banks. And I think that comes under the 196 billion that we were talking about with the EU, because it is frozen through the Euroclear trading system. Now, the European Union is having a very hard time coming to an agreement on that point about seizing the Russian assets. Canada could play a very decisive and positive role here, being pivotal in seizing the Russian assets that are in the Canadian, that are under the control of the Canadian government. Now, that can happen through this act of parliament that I was just mentioning, CIMA, but it could also be done by fiat, simply by insertion of a line item in the next Canadian federal budget, which is due on November 4th. So there's a lobbying effort going on right now for Canada to take exactly that kind of action. I've been in touch with some very influential Canadian Ukrainian lobby groups. One of them is the Peace Coalition, which is based there in Kyiv, and they've been playing a very important coordinating role with Ukrainian, let's say, a Ukrainian activist support group in Canada. And there might be a open letter coming out fairly soon, but I can't comment further because that decision hasn't been made. But yes, the discussion is underway.
Well,
There are ways of being looked at.
I am an enormous fan of our neighbors to the north when it comes to their support for Ukraine. It's been extraordinary, and not least of which because of the large diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora that exists in Canada. So, Canada, absolutely do it, because I think, and now, again, not being an expert in this kind of stuff, but having watched my fair share of geopolitical relationship and kind of how the machinery works, is that once a precedent is set, other folks are more likely to jump in. Could at some point we see whether it's the Canadians or I believe it's the Danish who are floating some pretty big ideas about Caesars and all the rest of it. Can you foresee a time coming anytime soon that if this does happen, and I understand what you said there with, this is a big if, but if 3 countries, 4 countries start doing this kind of thing, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 will also, so at what point, I guess I'm asking, at what point is the precedent set for others to follow? And subsequently, do you believe that will happen?
Okay. Well, the precedent has to be set. Someone has to go first, and that's why I'm certainly hoping, looking at Canada being in a very interesting position where it could be a global leader. This is a country that makes multilateralism and being a team player in the West a virtue and a foundation of Canadian foreign policy. But here we have an opportunity for Canada to be a leader. And it's not like it's coming out of left field. Those discussions are underway in the EU, and they're getting bogged down on technical matters and the need for unanimity. Whereas Canada could play a role. Is it going to happen? Well, in my crystal ball, I don't know. I'm just hoping it will, because logically everything supports that. If you are a Western country wanting Ukraine to prevail, wanting a government in Kyiv that is elected and chosen by the Ukrainian people, we want that to persist and that Ukraine goes on as a sovereign nation. It has to outlast this terrible war from Russia. And at a time when Russia is trading in these narratives that it's going to ignore its own military weakness and just keep saying we'll carry on indefinitely. That calculation has to be punctured. This is an opportunity. Canada could do it. I certainly hope they do take leadership. And there's a crowd-in effect in that there's a parallel process, as discussed, underway for the European Union to do just that. Other countries can be invited to join that action. I think the other ones would be the UK, which is outside the Euro system,
Mhm.
but I'm sure there's Russian assets seized as well. I think the US. We could just extend that to, let's say, other non-EU Western nations. That's Australia, Japan, South Korea, on. Could have a massive effect. It is a game changer. It does have the potential really to change the dynamic. Let's hope and see.
And as we kind of start circling around down to a conclusion here, I do want to talk to you about the Ukrainian economy. We obviously have to discuss that. This is where we are. We are in Ukraine. Now, it is being propped up
Mm-hmm.
by foreign aid. And there's much discussion. Obviously, without foreign aid, Ukraine would be in dire straits.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about the state of the Ukrainian economy with all of these factors.
I think the story there, Phil, is resilience. This economy has weathered an onslaught and what could easily have produced economic collapse and hardship for Ukrainians. The government has managed to marshal its forces and international aid and go on running a fairly stable macroeconomic policy environment. Um, this is sort of a strange dichotomy in that, yes, all the resources are being put at the disposal of the armed forces to the extent possible, but the rest of the Ukrainian government has to go on being funded, and it is being funded by external support, bilateral and multilateral, quite extensive, and the economy has responded to that. I was looking at some data, and in the opening year of the war, 2022, the Ukraine economy contracted by 29%. Well, it's not surprising. Nearly a third of the country's territory was occupied. Since then, some of it's been won back with the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives. But there's still a big chunk of the country that was lost. But we have had since then quite robust rebounding growth. In 2023, it was like 4.5, 5+%, I think. Similar number 2024, and now we're looking at growth again this year, probably 2 to 2.5%. That would actually exceed Russia's own projected GDP growth in 2025 of 1%. So lots of it's a great story here of resilience for the Ukrainian economy. There's been a fantastic pas de deux act between external supporters and the Ukrainian government, and we've managed to avert what could have been economic catastrophe. So resilience, pockets of success. As you know from being in this country, there's sort of a veneer of normality amidst war. So people still go on living their lives. I'm sure you'll notice in Kyiv and other cities, the cafes and restaurants and bars look like they're full.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you go right up to the front lines, I'm being told that even in Kherson, uh, there's a section of town further back from the river where people are also still going to restaurants. Well, that's great. It shows normality. Lots of other strong points in the Ukraine economy. There are sources of growth. The defense sector is a massive source of growth. You have all of these Ukrainian defense tech startups, particularly in drones, that are world beaters. And there's a lot of foreign direct investment from Western defense firms and private equity going right now into Ukrainian defense, because this is this one big laboratory. Test all that military technology in real time under battle conditions with constant feedback from the ultimate client, which is the armed forces of Ukraine. So you're getting constant innovation. That's a source of growth. I'm being told that the growth this year, at least a third of it will come from the defense sector. That's predominantly private sector companies. The government's also been looking at the idea of exporting weapons during the war. Now, obviously, that's quite controversial on one level. You'd say, well, everything has to go to the war effort. Well, you've got these defense startups. There's a bit of a gap in that it's almost limitless what they can produce if someone gives them enough money to buy those products. And the amount of money that the Ukrainian government has in its annual budget to support weapons purchases domestically is not infinite. So if successful Ukrainian defense and military technology companies have orders, they should go ahead and fill them.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
we
great
we
choice, a great
recently
example of resilience.
yeah, we recently had on one of our other episodes, the CEO of one of these drone startups, and he made the point that if exports are allowed, and apparently President Zelensky he said it at the UN, he's going to start allowing this,
Mhm,
is that it what that does is it allows them to sell drones that maybe are now obsolete or no longer
mhm,
filling the role that is needed on the front line. They sell those to other nations. That gives them funds to then circle it back and buy
mhm.
more artillery rounds or more infantry fighting vehicles or something. So
Sure,
it's this,
whatever.
yeah, and you're right, it is resilience, and it's the brilliance of the Ukrainian people. Visiting and spending time here as well. I'm sure you have gone to a restaurant or even a supermarket, and you are always
Yeah,
given the option to add to your bill a 10%, that you can send to the armed forces. I mean, this is
mhm.
a very unified country. Um, so you are cautiously optimistic of the state of Ukraine's economy, even though that they desperately need this, the support, the external foreign aid. But there are some green
Yes, I
shoots.
am. I am. I am positive because the track record has been quite good. We've had competent macroeconomic management and a very difficult balancing act of producing growth in a country at war and fighting for its own survival. That's just a remarkable accomplishment.
Yeah, and
And
you
lots of companies.
could lose your industrial east, which would be horrible, and all the mines and the natural resources that are out there. You still have the
Mhm.
agribusiness, which of course is
Yes.
enormous. This is the breadbasket of so many different countries get their food from here, and now that we have that corridor out in Europe, I don't know. I as a layman looking at it, I don't. I think the Ukrainians are doing another example of Ukrainian exceptionalism, uh, uh, outstanding performance given the circumstances. Um, Douglas, I have enjoyed speaking with you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I again will be adding links to all of Douglas's works. The economic discussions we've had. I'm sure will be included in many of them, but also your impression of the Ukrainian people, how they are bearing up, your travels around the country and your interactions with them. And so I would like to conclude our conversation with something that is admittedly a little bit bittersweet. You recently put out an article
Mhm.
in which your opinion was that this war is going to go on for a long time. And sadly, the Ukrainians are coming to the realization of that. I would like to give you the opportunity now to kind of, as we close, what are your impressions of the Ukrainian people during this war, and where nobody has a crystal ball, but what are your impressions of the of where this war is going?
Sure. Thank you. Well, the question I was asked to be asked, and I pose it periodically when I come back on these missions, is how does this end? Uh, we assume it is going to end, and all we can do is apply logic and reason and empirical fact, look at the underlying trends, and draw conclusions from that. So I think any reasonable observer should be able to look at the objective situation of Ukraine and all the changing dynamic and different parties involved, including Russia and the external parties on both sides, both sets of supporters, and say, where does this go? It has to end. Everyone wants it to end, but it has to end on terms where you define victory in terms of Ukraine persisting as a sovereign nation and persisting as a democracy with an open society. The alternatives are horrific. It would be a subjugation in the event of either a Russian military victory or substantial Russian gains to the point where the Ukrainian government had to sue for peace and accept unacceptable terms. Well, those terms, we know what they are because the Russian side has been articulating them without any substantive compromise or change for 3+ years, which is they don't want Ukraine to be in NATO, and they would like to have a Russian-friendly government in power. And that subjugation scenario is just a terrible one. Fortunately, I don't think the facts of the matter support that outcome. We have to look at high-low scenarios. That's certainly a low one. I don't think it is the most likely one. The more likely one is at some point the war is stopped when both sides reach a conclusion that continuing is too costly. And I think both sides are not there yet. Ukraine's red lines are, we cannot stop, we're being attacked, and the aggressor is going to have to definitively stop, and we need security guarantees from external parties to make sure they don't come back for another round. That seems to be the outline of an agreement. I think a land for peace deal is ultimately going to be part of that. We have to accept that Russia is going to hold on to its ill-gotten gains. That's a terrible future for those who are left under Russian occupation, and the whole other discussion of just what it's like in the occupied territories in regard to observation of free will and human rights. And the situation there is just horrific, catastrophic. We saw those, the conditions under which referendums were held in Donetsk and the captured regions, including Zaporizhzhia. So that's one scenario that no one really wants. So a bad scenario would be, you lose the territory and you have a pro-Russian government, but maybe it's an acceptable cost that at some point the war stops. Both sides would have to agree, freeze the lines where they are now. The Russian demand is they want more than that. They want all the unoccupied parts of Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. That's an unrealistic goal. There's no way the Ukrainians want to give that up. The Russian army has been unable to conquer those territories, have them under its possession in 3.5 years. So it's probably not a realistic scenario for Russia. But yes, there does need to be some kind of land for peace agreement. That is very painful for Ukraine. It's a bitter pill to swallow. I look at the analogies kind of like West Germany during the Cold War. Germany never definitively or by de jure ceded those territories. It just had to wait until they could come back. And maybe we're going to have to wait for another geopolitical shift at some point in the future for those territories to come back. We can live in hope for that. In the meantime, Ukraine as a country does have to get on with its destiny, and that is integration with the European Union and Western markets and putting in place safeguards for democratic standards. So we have that already. Ukrainians themselves have been the ones that have been ensuring that. We even saw protests against the government about interference with the independence of independent institutions involved in corruption or transparency, and Ukrainians did demonstrate against their government in terms of no, they don't want the appearance of political control of the judiciary or of transparency-related institutions. So yes, I think the Ukrainians are insisting on democratic gains, hard-won democratic gains being consolidated. Yes, I think that's possible. And just to say kind of in conclusion here, it's sort of easy for Putin in terms of he's a dictator, so he can define victory in any way he wants without a lot of domestic political consequence. So if at some point, maybe, I don't know, a year from now, longer, hopefully shorter, maybe tomorrow, they say they say uncle and will agree seriously on negotiations, and that means Ukraine would be allowed to be free, and defining success on the Ukrainian side in terms of this country carrying on as a sovereign nation that is democratic, where democratic norms are entrenched and an open society is allowed to function. That is certainly possible. That would be an ideal, that's a very positive outcome for Ukraine, that it survives the war intact as a society. Is every last inch of territory going to be liberated? No, it's unfortunate, but that isn't possible. I can see sort of a shift in the country. I asked that question in 2022, how does it end? And can there be a land for peace deal? No one wanted to talk about it. You kind of understand the government in that, yes, privately they might accept it, but that's a narrative you can't, or they could not admit in public. They still can't really admit it in public, but if you ask most Ukrainians, I think they will say, yeah, we want to fight on. Would we accept peace and giving up some of our territory? Yeah, really reluctantly and with painful regret. But if that's the price of peace, then it's an acceptable one. Defining victory in terms of Ukraine being sovereign, free, and independent, yes, that is an absolute solid outcome. It's a bloody nose for Putin and his imperial ambitions. Then we don't see the sort of corrupt oligarchic style of rule that has been consolidated in the periphery states of the ex-Soviet Union in Central Asia and Belarus. Those are just horrific examples for Ukrainians. They don't want to follow, and I don't think they will.
I agree with you. I think it's also worth mentioning that those protests that you are referring to were not put down violently. They were allowed to happen. The people of Ukraine exercised one of their fundamental rights, and that is the right of assembly. And they did so without getting their heads bashed in, and put that in contrast to what happens in Russia if you even hold up a placard on Red Square. And that is something we cannot forget. And those of us who support Ukraine and believe in liberal democracy need to recognize. This has been a wonderful conversation, Douglas. I appreciate you letting me focus primarily on the economic factors of these things, because it's a topic that I again, want to understand better. And every opportunity I get to help my audience understand a little bit better, I seize upon it. So I appreciate you taking the time out today to do this, and I appreciate your coverage. So thanks for being on the Edge.
Phil, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.